The intern they dismissed as harmless just uncovered the fallback code I never named, because I taught her where to look, not what to find. I didn't leave her instructions, not in the way people expect. No checklist, no handoff folder marked in case they erase me. Just fragments. One line of code buried inside an old payroll sandbox. A script hidden in the metadata of a vendor audit file no one read since the pandemic. And a sentence I said once, offhand, maybe even softly sarcastic. If they ever tell you not to look, that's when you look twice. I wasn't sure she'd remember it, but then again I didn't leave it for her to remember, I left it for her to feel. Haley had been one of the few interns who actually paid attention, not because she was eager, but because she was curious, in the right way. She never clicked for the sake of completion. She hovered. She questioned the phrasing and documentation that others skimmed. I noticed it on week 2. She asked me what a holdback vendor routing class was and why it was tagged as morale support in the Q3 column. I remember thinking, she saw it. Even before I connected the dots, she saw the fracture, the flaw in the loop. So when they cut me out, when they erased my credentials and thought I'd disappear, I didn't run to anyone. I waited, and I watched. Not the systems, not the vendors. I watched her. Because Haley didn't flinch the day I vanished. She didn't ask questions, she just paused, and I saw it. 2 days later, in the back-end sandbox logs, she pulled up the bonus folder again. Quiet, no flags, no shared drive pings. She was watching. Still, and that was all I needed. At 2:13 a.m. last Thursday, I sent one message. No sender name. No reply address. Just one line. You saw what they buried. Keep watching. And don't blink. It wasn't a test. It was a mirror. If she had looked away, if she had tried to report it, escalate it, explain it, I would have pulled back, but she didn't. She read it once. And 5 minutes later, she accessed the ghost sandbox I left buried behind vendor 4. That was her answer. She remembered. And more than that, she trusted the silence, because she didn't need to be told what to do. She just needed confirmation that she wasn't crazy, that someone else saw the loop too. And that was me. I didn't need her to hack anything. I didn't need her to steal files. I just needed her to stay in the system long enough for the pattern to surface. And it did. That same afternoon, she logged access to a file that had been renamed 4 times. She noticed it because the metadata hadn't updated, because the system thought no one would check a morale bonus flagged Q3 deferred do not sync. But she did, and by the time legal moved to mask the routing trail, she had already saved a local copy. Not to upload, not to share, just to keep. And that's all I ever needed her to do. They thought she was harmless, just another intern, still new, still quiet, still trying to figure out where the real coffee was brewed. But they didn't realize what I left behind wasn't code, it wasn't leverage, it was memory, living memory. I didn't trust servers, I didn't trust policies. I trusted someone who still looked twice at a clean spreadsheet and said, why this total? She didn't know I was still watching. Still logging the access trails. Still reading the variable shifts every time a new cost center appeared and vanished within 12 hours. But I was. And when I saw her reopen that payroll loop and hover, just hover over the row that never reconciled, I knew. She was still with me. Still inside the system. And the beautiful part? They didn't know she was a threat. Because she wasn't pushing back. She wasn't pointing fingers. She was just quietly not blinking. That's the most dangerous type of witness. The kind who doesn't make noise, the kind who keeps every version, the kind who doesn't send alarms, just signals. And I knew she'd be the first to see the loop they forgot to lock. I didn't need her to find the whole scheme. That was never the point. All I needed was for her to notice the rhythm, the heartbeat buried inside the noise. And she did. Exactly where I expected her to. The 18th. That was the node I left untouched, not marked, not explained, just repeated, quietly, deliberately, through 12 consecutive vendor logs. Every third Thursday. 4 payments, all within a 9-minute window. Identical memo structures, different vendor codes, but always, the same underlying reference tag. Q4, morale holdback, cleared. No one was supposed to question it. Not when it looked so official, so patterned. That was the genius of it. If you hide something inside repetition, people assume it's meant to be there. And most people, they scroll past repetition. But Haley didn't. She circled it, she highlighted the routing timestamps and ran cross-sheet comparisons. I saw her logs. She opened 2 quarters worth of disbursement records and filtered by hour, not by department. That's not something you do unless you suspect the manipulation isn't about who, but when. That's how I knew she was tracing the pattern, not the fraud, the design. Because this wasn't theft. It was rhythm, an engineered loop of ghost payments that rerouted before they could be flagged. And when I watched her pull up the cost center trail on vendor adjustment sync 4, I smiled. She'd found it. The shadow vendor with a deactivated compliance tag, the one they thought was buried because it hadn't been called in 8 months. But the loop didn't need active vendors. It only needed placeholders with ghost logic. The bonus was cloned from one source file, my file, and slipped into multiple output sheets through a fallback protocol I left unlocked on purpose. Fallback_2 was only supposed to activate if the UI failed, but it also triggered when a file was called through batch scripting instead of manual access. And I knew eventually someone trying to mass replace logs would take the faster route. They did. And in doing so, they exposed the fallback fingerprint. Haley ran the same audit parser I once taught her during a bug simulation, back when we were patching routing slippage from Q1. She thought it was just a learning moment, but I embedded a hidden return. Anytime a fallback tag appeared more than twice within a single vendor class, the script would flag it as a ghost clone. She found 3 in a single day, all tied to rerouted bonus entries. I didn't have to be in the room. I didn't have to send instructions. She was already doing exactly what I hoped she would. Logging, not reacting, not reporting, just tracing. Quietly. That's what made her dangerous. They didn't even know she was looking. That night, she didn't access the folder again, but she left a signal, an edit. She renamed a local sheet Loop 18 Newsy Check. To anyone else, it was nothing, but to me, it was a message. She wasn't just keeping records, she was constructing the skeleton, and I knew that meant she saw the loop not as coincidence, but as choreography. That's when I knew she was past the point of return. Haley couldn't unsee the 18th anymore. And that's what made the system vulnerable. Not the files, not the ghost credentials, but the fact that someone had now attached pattern to intent. Because once that connection is made, the whole structure starts to collapse inward. They thought by replacing file names and wiping previous sync tags they could clean the data trail, but they never cleaned the logic. And that's what Haley followed, not the trail, the rhythm, and every beat brought her closer to the center. The vendor IDs, the shared approval strings, the fallback protocol. They were all pieces I had once touched, and now, so was she. She didn't need my name. She didn't need permission. She just needed the pulse, and now she was tracing it, row by row, sync by sync. Not with a spotlight, not with alarms, with quiet certainty. Because when a system repeats itself with too much confidence, someone like Haley starts to listen to what it's trying to hide. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The system it came from hadn't carried my name for months, not since the night they tried to erase me with a termination timestamp and a revised access registry. But I had left behind more than just credentials. I'd left behind a rhythm, an echo, a trail disguised as decay. And inside that decay, there were still fragments of me, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. She was always good at that, Haley. She didn't rush to conclusions, she hovered. She looked without grabbing. Asked the quiet kind of questions that made you check your own assumptions twice before answering. And I knew if anyone could read between the silences, it would be her. So I sent it. 6 words. No sender ID, no metadata trail that wouldn't blend into static, just a plain text packet dropped into a dev relay I'd buried months ago under a training script for interns. Keep watching, and don't blink. That was all. I chose the timing carefully. 2:13 a.m., her logs showed she'd been returning to the Q3 bonus directory around that hour each night for a week, never editing, never downloading, just observing. As if she knew that touching anything too soon might set off an alarm. That night I waited, not in the system. I'd long been scrubbed from visible trace, but through an old echo route tied to an inactive mirror terminal. It wasn't much, just enough to catch pings. 5 minutes passed. She didn't reply, but she didn't log out either. Instead, she opened a local copy of a file that had once passed through my hands, one I knew had been rewritten, whitewashed, and reissued under a new file name, with the same checksum but a different signature trail. I watched her access the compare_version script, the one I'd modified during an off-newer bug fix. No one else even knew it existed, but she remembered. That was the reply. She read the file for 20 minutes, never saved, never copied, just tracked scroll patterns that matched every anomaly from the fallback protocol. She clicked on column 17, paused, and then ran a trace tag I embedded a year ago in a joke training sheet titled April_Fools_audit. That tag wasn't supposed to do anything, but it did. It triggered a string match that flagged recurring payment identifiers cloaked in wellness stipend language, identifiers that linked to ghost accounts. The moment she saw the pattern light up, she didn't flinch, didn't share, just highlighted the row, changed the comment field to one word, again. I saw it, and I knew. She didn't panic, she didn't overreach, she just kept going. One cell at a time, 1 hour at a time. Just like I had when I first saw the loop. She wasn't trying to save me. She wasn't even trying to fight back. She was doing what no one else had done since I left. Keeping track. That's what makes her dangerous. Not noise, not confrontation, memory. Unwavering, methodical memory. She didn't forward my message. Didn't quote it. But 30 minutes later, she accessed a secondary log mirror I'd hidden behind a deprecated vendor archive. It was only possible to find if you looked for documents with no owner tag and ran a redundancy conflict scan. She did, and she renamed it. Seen_not_yet_proven. A folder name that told me everything I needed to know. She didn't need reassurance. She needed confirmation that the weight she'd been carrying wasn't imaginary. And now that she had it, she wasn't going to hesitate. She was going to build, quietly, intelligently, in ways that no one would notice until it was too late. The next day I watched as the bonus sheet was edited from a new terminal, not hers, someone higher. A panic move. They'd seen access they didn't expect, and they responded like most scared people do, with overcorrection. But it was too late. Haley had already saved a hashed fingerprint of the original. She renamed the new version same_skin_different_bones and printed it. On paper. Because sometimes the safest file is the one no one thinks to encrypt. I didn't contact her again. Didn't need to. She didn't need instruction. She needed space. And maybe, just maybe, permission to trust her own instinct. I gave her that. With 6 words. She gave me a binder full of shadows they thought they'd buried. And that's all I ever needed. She didn't reply. And that silence, that was the reply I wanted. They didn't delete it. That's not how they work. Deletion leaves a gap. Something that draws attention. No, what they do is rewrite. Same name, same column, same structure, but a different soul. A file that wears the skin of the old one, but breathes in a new rhythm. That's what Haley opened next. I knew it before she even clicked. I saw the pattern shift 3 hours prior. An overwrite ping from a shell login that shouldn't have had privileges to that folder. Fail. Again. A digital footprint more reckless than before. It told me everything. They were in a hurry. They thought someone had stumbled too close to the original. And so they did what they always do. Scramble the timestamp, flatten the changes, and publish a perfect replica. But they always forget the ghost layer. The one I'd embedded in f2row.ghost. A hidden subroutine that marked any file modified through indirect terminal paths. It didn't flash, it didn't alert, it just renamed one cell in the metadata with a small, almost invisible tag. Ghosted version equals 1. That tag was there now. I watched her cursor hover over it. She didn't click it, didn't ask what it meant. She just opened her original version, saved locally 2 weeks prior, and began the comparison. I knew what she'd find. Row 34, originally labeled as a morale bonus routed through Horizon metrics, now said Deferred Development Incentive closed. The line wasn't deleted, it was collapsed, hidden under a formatting trick that made it look like a blank entry unless expanded. She found it within 5 minutes. Then, row 56. Originally routed through an old vendor I flagged in a private sandbox, had a new path. Internal Skills Alignment Fund. They were layering new language over old fractures. But language doesn't rewrite intent. Haley knew that. And the moment she saw the reroute carried a new approval code tied to an inactive user ID, she tagged it. Red. Bold. In all caps. Same structure, different fingerprint. That's when I knew. She wasn't comparing anymore. She was documenting. This wasn't about identifying fraud. This was about proving design. That's far more dangerous. Because when someone like Haley starts to understand not just the what, but the why, it stops being a curiosity, it becomes a weapon. I saw her scroll to the bottom, last row. Duplicate entries with identical timestamps but different note fields. One said retention incentive, the other said onboarding, balance correction. Same amount, same minute. Two different justifications. That's not an accident, that's a forgery tactic. Create confusion so no one questions which is real. But Haley didn't get confused. She flagged both, drew a line between them, wrote one sentence on her printout. Which one did the system pay? That question has no safe answer, not for them, because either one leads back to a ghost vendor, and both carry fallback_2 routing. Very script I built as a redundancy, now repurposed to hide duplications. They used my tool against itself. And that was their mistake, because Haley knew what fallback_2 looked like. She traced it down to the ghost audit override flag I'd slipped in back when I was still in good standing. It was still there, still active. They hadn't cleaned it, just layered code around it like makeup on a cracked wall. She copied both versions of the file, renamed them, then created a third, a diff log showing 17 discrepancies, each marked with origin tags, timestamps, and approval pathways. It was beautiful. It was quiet. It was irreversible. And she didn't send it anywhere, she just saved it, locally, then printed the log and folded it into the back of a training binder labeled Q2-onboarding notes. No one would look there. And that's why it would survive. When the system tried to reconcile the changes the next morning, it didn't flag her. It flagged itself. The approval tree bounced back a ghost credential. The system paused. But not long enough. An hour later, a new version of the file replaced the overwritten one, this time with column 17 entirely removed, like it never existed. But it was too late. Haley had kept both ghosts, and now, so had I. She didn't know I still had access to the echo logs, that I was watching every overwrite cascade from the outside. But I was. And when I saw the last system echo whisper, all clear, I laughed, because no placeholder ever clears what's already been copied to paper. They didn't delete my fingerprint, they just tried to cover it with a new shade. But the ridges always return when the pressure's right. And pressure was coming. It was never about the files. Not really. Anyone can hide numbers in rows, reroute payments through shell vendors, overwrite approvals with prettier labels. That part's easy. What's hard is keeping the rhythm from being noticed. That's why I built it with intent. Back when I was still trusted, still the one they sent into the tangled roots of broken workflows, I learned something simple. The system doesn't lie, but it loops. And if you watch the loop long enough, it gives itself away. That's what Haley saw next. Not fraud, not malice, rhythm. I'd left the pulse right where it always lived, between bonus entries and credential shifts, the kind of data flow most people attribute to legacy sync lag or system chatter. But Haley didn't dismiss chatter. She logged it, cross-referenced terminal IDs. She'd started building a map. Not digital, not dynamic. Paper. She was drawing by hand, like someone who didn't trust what the screen was willing to show her. And I was right to trust her, because she found the loop, the rotation. One vendor ID ghosted, a credential, reused, bonus issued, then routed to a consulting group for alignment development, then closed. 31 days later, the same credential reappears under a different vendor. Same function, different tag. Rinse, repeat. To anyone else, it would look like disjointed activity. But not when you draw the arrows. Haley did. And in doing so, she uncovered something only I had seen before. The loop had a tail. Every third rotation fed back into a static holding account under a cost center named Wellspring_disperse. That name didn't exist in any live directory, but it existed in offline access logs, and when I saw her scan through batch 3 of those logs and underline the entry with a mechanical pencil, I knew. She had the tail, she didn't try to chase it, she didn't shout, she just wrote next to it. Same entry, 3 masks. Why? Then she started over. Built the same loop from a different entry point. A credential that should have been disabled. One tied to a former project coordinator whose name hadn't appeared in payroll since the January layoffs. Yet that credential was still approving vendor routing. Not directly. Through cascade triggers. That's an advanced move. Hide your approval inside a triggered script so it looks like system automation. It only works if no one audits the source, but Haley wasn't auditing for proof. She was watching for behavior, and behavior doesn't lie. She traced 3 more loops, found the anchor points, all of them linked to shell consulting groups with Bridge or Wellspring in their titles. Pretty names, clean names, names that sounded like they were helping. But the money always moved the same way, into shadows. Then back out again through incentive bonuses, routed in my old disbursement format. They used my design, my structure. They just stripped the safeguards and replaced them with noise. And Haley saw it. She updated her map, added another layer. This time, colored lines. Red for credentials, blue for vendor IDs, and in the center, a shape I recognized immediately. A 6-pointed rotation where each node fed 2 directions. Outward to justification, inward to erasure. It was the same model I once used to simulate redundancy failure during an internal training audit. I never published that model, but Haley remembered it. She kept her copy, she referenced it, and now she was using it as a blueprint to reconstruct the shell game they thought they'd buried. That's when I realized she didn't just see the loop. She understood it, and more importantly, she wasn't overwhelmed by it. She was methodical, patient. She wasn't trying to break it open. She was waiting for it to turn toward her, so she could document every beat as it passed. That night, she didn't log out. She just minimized her screen, left the paper map out on her desk, and walked away. Like she wanted someone to see it. And maybe she did. Maybe she was testing whether anyone was paying attention. They weren't, not yet, but I was. And I saw the note she left in the corner of the map. Every system spins, but even loops get dizzy. That's when I knew. She was no longer just following the code, she was starting to lead it. And they still thought she was reading onboarding documents. I knew she would save it. Not out of panic, not to expose, but because people like Haley don't let truth evaporate without keeping more version. That's the kind of intern she'd always been, quietly archiving what others deleted, not because she distrusted the system, but because she respected what silence could erase. And when the weight of the loop grew too heavy, when 3 vendor IDs blurred into one, and bonus lines kept cycling through new aliases, I knew she wouldn't keep storing it digitally. No one who understands fragility keeps everything in the cloud. So she did what I hoped she would. She printed the map. Every layer, every tag, every ghost credential and rerouted approval. Then she went to her drawer, pulled out a SanDisk drive, small, silver, fingerprint smudged, not new, not labeled, just familiar, a device no one would question if it vanished. She plugged it into an old offline terminal, one from the archival closet behind legal. It wasn't listed in the current directory anymore. Most employees didn't know it still booted, but Haley did. Because I'd shown her that terminal once, back when I was still real to the company. We were reviewing a failed payroll rollout and she asked why the logs didn't match. I showed her the terminal and said, because sometimes the past stores the truth when the present's too scared to. I didn't think she'd remember, but here she was, returning to it, like I'd never left. She didn't load everything at once. She copied it in segments, a folder for vendor traces, another for bonus overlays, one for credential loops, and finally, a PDF of her hand-drawn map, scanned on a machine 2 floors down. Each segment carefully named without giving anything away. Data_A, V_check, log X _3. Then one folder without a name, just a number. 1806 _411 _3242. The same numbers tied to the first fallback trigger she ever found. I saw her pause before copying it, like she understood the weight of it. Then she dragged it across. The LED blinked, slow, then faster, then still, and just like that, it was done. No ceremony, no speech, just a breath, held and released. She didn't eject the drive. She didn't pocket it. Instead, she walked to the back of the terminal, unscrewed a vent panel no one had touched in years, and placed the flash drive inside. Not hidden, not buried, just placed. Deliberately, like it belonged there. She closed the panel, tightened the screws, wiped her fingerprints off the case, and left. I watched the logs echo her steps, Not through cameras, not through alerts, but through terminal heartbeat pulses. Old code I'd written still monitoring for access by anyone who remembered the machine's BIOS string. And it matched hers. Exactly. I smiled because she didn't send it to me. She didn't send it to anyone, but she had sent it somewhere. A message in steel, a version that couldn't be overwritten. That night, as the system logs showed minor credential cleanup and bonus reclassification for alignment, she didn't log in. She didn't try to watch the scramble. She just went home, which told me everything. She wasn't afraid they'd catch her. She wasn't racing against time. She was ahead of them, quietly, calmly, the way I had once been, before they rewrote me out. The next morning, a new folder appeared on the shared drive. Bonus sync reapproved clean copy. I laughed. They still thought naming it clean would make it invisible, but they didn't know Haley had already preserved the dirt. And now, so had I. Because what she stored in that drive wasn't just a backup. It was a moment. The moment the truth left their hands and found sanctuary. And if everything else burned, if every server collapsed, if every record vanished from the cloud, there would still be that flash drive. Untouched, unlabeled, but very, very real. Just like the person who placed it there. They didn't call her in. That would have left a trail. And they weren't ready for trails. Not yet. No flagged emails, no surprise audits, just a coffee break. Casual, harmless, perfectly timed. But I knew what it was. I recognized the choreography. When a system's nervous, it doesn't roar, it whispers. And this was a whisper, dressed in politeness. I caught it in the logs first. Legal's badge pinged the elevator at 4:02. Then Gary's access code registered at the level 4 break room, 2 minutes before Haley's terminal auto-locked. She wasn't followed. They didn't need to. Just intersected. Just enough to make it feel random. But nothing in that building ever was. Gary was the kind of man you didn't notice until he asked about the lunch schedule twice in a row. He never raised his voice, never broke protocol. He was legal liaison, but moved like facilities, which made him perfect. The kind of operator who checks the floor before the floor realizes it's being checked. Haley walked in. Normal pace, no hesitation. The coffee pot was half full, lukewarm. Gary stood by it with a paper cup, just stirring. Not drinking, stirring. Long night? He asked. Not an accusation, just a rhythm, Haley answered without pause. Some Q3 reconciliations flagged inconsistent. Figured I'd clean them before they become someone else's Monday. Calm. Direct. A reply that didn't over-explain. I watched through the system echo. No visuals, just ambient pings. She moved around him like gravity, not fear. That's what struck me. She didn't pause near exits. She didn't change her tone, but she did something better. She asked him a question. You working on vendor tags from the metrics audit? And there it was. The reversal. That subtle pressure shift that people like Gary aren't built to handle. He blinked. Some tags, yeah. Cleaning up some ghost trails. You know how it is. I smiled. 'Cause now I knew. He was improvising. He didn't expect her to volley back, and the moment she did, his response fractured. Like ghost trails? No one says that unless they're hiding who planted them. Haley didn't press. She just sipped her coffee, then tapped her access badge twice, once to re-enter, once to leave. The second tap was extra, redundant, but she knew it would echo. She was leaving fingerprints on silence, making the system remember she'd passed through. I scanned the logs again. 38 minutes after that coffee, a scrub file appeared in the vendor rollback queue, labeled Temp Sync Realign, Do Not Deploy. That's what you send when you're trying to clean up without alerting the cleanup crew. I didn't need to guess who placed it. Legal was moving now. Not fully, not fast, just adjusting their weight. But that's how instability begins. A system that shifts without warning, starts to crack without sound. Haley returned to her desk and made one update, not to the system, to her notebook. Physical, handwritten, Gary, 4:04 p.m. Break room, stirring, not sipping. Legal, elevator, ping, 4:02. Underneath that, in a separate column, no questions about projects, just watch my left hand. That told me everything. She hadn't flinched, she'd logged. And when people like Haley log something, they're not guessing, they're confirming. She wasn't asking if she was being watched, she was tracking who was pretending not to. and she was winning. That's when I noticed the security ping. A request for badge history on Haley's ID, scoped to printer access for the last 72 hours. That wasn't HR. That was internal control. Someone wanted to know what she was copying. But they weren't brave enough to confront her, not directly, because confronting her would mean acknowledging that something was wrong. That something might be bigger than a vendor misfire. So they played it safe, subtle, slow. But she felt it. And she logged that, too. 20 minutes later, she printed 2 dummy documents, public onboarding guides, then accessed a folder with no sensitive data, paused there for 11 seconds, then logged out without changing anything. She was feeding the system noise, beautiful, deliberate noise. And the watchers, they recorded it all, thinking they were smart, thinking she was nervous. But she wasn't. She was building fog, just enough to make them think she wasn't a threat. Yet. That night, after hours, she returned, not through the front, through the old maintenance stairwell I once showed her back when we mapped emergency exits for a fire drill. No cameras, no swipe logs, just steel and silence. She didn't do anything extraordinary. She just replaced one binder with another, identical label, different contents. The original, with printed logs, ghost tag samples, and her map, was gone. And in its place, nothing but onboarding notes. Exactly what anyone curious would expect. She wasn't hiding. She was rotating her truth, just like they did. That's when I realized they were right to be afraid. They just hadn't realized it yet. Because Haley didn't run, she stayed in orbit, and systems don't break from direct hits. They unravel from tiny, quiet rotations the center can't track. They tried to measure her panic, but she wasn't panicking, she was patterning, and I could feel it. Subtle but unmistakable, the system had started to stutter. Audits don't just happen, not the real ones. The real ones don't come from policy, they come from pressure. And pressure had been building quietly ever since Haley started tracing the loops. I saw it ripple before anyone spoke a word. Systems pinged longer between credential approvals. Disbursement queues were locked for manual override 4 times in a week. Then, the magic word appeared. Review. Not in bold, not even in a subject line, just in the body of an internal message forwarded to the compliance cluster from legal. Timestamp 1043, IMing. The phrasing was artfully vague. In light of recent reallocations, we may need to prepare a package for external review, if requested. That if told me everything. It wasn't a command, it was a flare, a way of testing who would flinch. And flinch they did, because 37 minutes later, the bonus allocation module went into sync fail mode, a ghost issue triggered when someone manually disrupts a clean loop with conflicting authorizations. I built that flag. It wasn't a glitch, it was a signal, a tripwire to let me know someone had tried to reconcile too fast. Haley saw it too. She opened the shared payroll queue and noticed the rollback list had grown by 11 entries. She didn't touch them. She printed the index instead, just names, IDs, timestamps. Then she ran a diff check on the archived versions and saw what I expected. Routing inconsistencies with fallback _2 overlays. 5 of them. Too perfect to be anything but scripted correction. The kind you don't run unless you think someone's about to ask the wrong question. And then came the audit email. 2:06 p.m. Subject: Preparation for potential financial review. Recipients: Compliance, Legal, and Payroll Ops. I saw the meta trail, generated from a template titled pre-aud _Q4 _setup. That template only lived on one terminal, Gary's. And the moment it was sent, I watched 4 approval routes go dark. Not removed, just suspended. As if someone had pulled a cable halfway and hoped the light wouldn't flicker. It flickered. Haley saw it too. She printed the email, but didn't react. No folder movement, no escalations, just a new line in her notebook. Audit template 17A, Gary's origin, legal watching their own tail. Then something strange happened. At 3:31 p.m. a follow-up was scheduled, a calendar block titled Financial Systems Dry Run, Room B12. But it never happened. I watched the block disappear from the server logs at 3:42 p.m., 11 minutes after it was created. Cancelled without explanation, no replacement, no notice. Just gone. That's not how audits work. That's how panic looks when it's trying not to leave footprints. I imagined the room, half set, Someone preparing slides that would never be shown. Someone else whispering, "Too soon, too exposed." And I could feel the tremor ripple through the command chain. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know how much. Had already been seen, Haley folded the printout of the audit notice and slipped it into the back of her planner. Not filed, not scanned, just kept. As if she knew it might disappear. And she was right. Because at 5:17 p.m., the original email vanished from the shared inbox logs. Recalled. But the system lagged. Haley had already saved the header string. Reaud _Q4 _setup GW172. That tag doesn't lie. Even if the message is gone, the tag echoes. And that echo was all I needed. I checked the terminal logs and confirmed. Gary had tried to cover the file with a draft error placeholder, but his machine timestamp didn't match the original. It was too late. The ghost had already spoken. That's when I smiled, because they thought they still had time. They thought Haley was just tracking anomalies. But she was documenting erasure, and I was watching. The system didn't show alarms. It showed hesitation. And hesitation spreads. 2 terminals re-authenticated twice in an hour. Legal's file tree flattened, consolidated into one bland directory labeled compliance assets. That only happens when someone's preparing for questions they don't want to answer. And yet, nothing official moved. No one announced anything. The audit was dead, at least, officially. But Haley never cared about official. She printed the calendar placeholder, pinned it inside her locker, wrote across it, "Audits don't get canceled, only postponed." And I knew exactly what she meant. Because the real audit wasn't a meeting. It was already happening. Quietly, cell by cell, file by file, one rotation at a time. And now? They'd confirmed it with their silence. I knew it was coming. The cleanup always begins the same way. Not with apologies, not with accountability, just quiet removal. The kind you send at 6:41 p.m. when you assume the building is empty and the intern is too green to question anything. That's when the email arrived. Subject line, "Access streamlining for support roles." It wasn't addressed to Haley directly. It never is. It went to her manager, her department head, and legal's compliance inbox, CC'd to someone under the name OpsExec5, which I knew was the COO's ghost credential. The message didn't accuse her, didn't name her. It just recommended a scheduled security refresh and temporary deactivation of non-essential rotational access points. That's corporate for shut it down before someone sees too much. It looked harmless, routine, but Haley knew better. And so did I. Because that phrasing, temporary deactivation, was one I'd written into the system's own audit trail a year ago when I designed the credential cascade policy. Try romancing. I knew the template, I knew how it would sound, and more importantly, I knew what they'd expect her to do. Panic, reach out, ask questions, try to explain why she still needed access. But Haley didn't do any of that. She read the message once. Sat still. Then, without replying, without alerting anyone, she copied the email header. Not the message, just the metadata. She saved it in a local text file, then did something I hadn't predicted but deeply appreciated. She opened a terminal I hadn't seen accessed in over 8 months, one labeled Provenance-Schools. It was buried under the compliance training drive, a ghost inbox, established when I still had permissions to conduct external audit prep. No one used it anymore, no one but me. I'd left it open, just in case. Just in case someone remembered. Haley did. She typed the address manually, audit.trace@provenance.tools. Then she forwarded the message. Not the whole thing, just the headers. That's all I needed. That's all I ever needed, because headers don't lie. They tell the origin, the timestamp, the route it took, and that route told me the COO hadn't just known, he'd initiated it. I felt the quiet click of the final pattern falling into place. The credential loop I'd been tracing now had a name, and Haley had just delivered the key, not by reporting, not by sounding alarms, just by sending the message to where it needed to land. She didn't ask for confirmation, she didn't expect a reply. She just closed the window and locked her terminal. That's what made her different. She wasn't trying to be part of the story. She was placing evidence into the hands of the one person who still knew how to carry it. Me. I scanned the headers. They lined up perfectly with the fallback _2 credential approvals, the ghost routing timestamps, and the bonus disbursements flagged during the Q3 morale sync. It was all connected. Not in theory, in traceable sequence, and now I had the final link, the initiator, the point of origin. That email would never make it into the audit logs. They'd erase it, call it a mistake, say it was part of a broader refresh. But it didn't matter, because the version Haley sent, that one was already stored. Outside their reach, I backed it up twice, once in the archive under trace_branch, and once on a cold terminal they'd forgotten existed. I read it one more time, then whispered, "Thank you." She didn't hear it. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any reply. That night, 3 additional intern credentials were revoked, not just Haley's, a sweep, a cleansing, as if removing 5 people would distract from the one who had already finished her work. But the real mistake wasn't revoking access, it was confirming fear. When you start locking doors no one was knocking on, someone notices. Haley noticed, and in her notebook, under a new tab titled, "Things They Tried to Undo," she wrote, "They tried to close the door after the letter had already been mailed." That was it. No anger, no arrogance, just record. That's all this had ever been, a record of what they built, of what they tried to erase. And of the one intern who didn't blink when the system tried to vanish her. She stopped investigating. That's how I knew something had changed. No more new logs pulled, no more rollback comparisons, no more scroll trace patterns or diff scans on bonus archives. Haley wasn't looking for cracks anymore. She was tracing foundation. The system had always been theirs, shaped by their rules, filtered through their language, but now? Now she was speaking something else. The first sign was subtle. She updated a shared worksheet. Nothing flagged, nothing bold, just a quiet note at the bottom of the access tracker, format locked by HS, that had never appeared before. The company used system-wide ownership identifiers. This was different. This was personal, intentional, like signing a canvas instead of stamping a report. She wasn't tracking their structure anymore. She was laying out her own. That week, 3 internal folders were restructured under compliance review. All 3 had been black-boxed for months. But Haley didn't request access. She restored them. Not by force, by fluency. She used the same fallback _2 syntax they'd built to hide reroutes and rewrote the logic. The system accepted it, because it had never been taught to question her. They thought removing her badge was enough. They never removed her presence. Because her fingerprints weren't on doors, they were in design, and now she was speaking in its native language. Quietly, Haley started correcting, one vendor tag at a time, not deleting, amending. She took ghost approval loops and backlabeled them with non-convergent logic detected, paused. It was a phrase I'd once used in a simulation module, back when I'd trained staff on recursion errors. No one else ever used it, but now it was reappearing. Everywhere. She didn't ask for permission, she didn't wait for oversight, she just began to unspin the chaos they left behind. The system wasn't resisting. It was adapting, because when someone understands how a structure breathes, they don't break it, they redirect its airflow. That's what she was doing, redirecting. I watched from the echo logs, a shadow, no longer needed, but unable to look away. Each move she made was measured, each correction subtle. She wasn't broadcasting a revolution, she was rewriting the terms of obedience. I recognized the pattern on day 4. The audit trail had a heartbeat again, not erratic, not panicked, steady, purposeful, and hers. Even the terminal idle messages started to change. Instead of sync complete, one displayed status reconciled. That was new. That wasn't ours. That was Haley, writing her own audit language. She had moved beyond tracing what they'd hidden. She was now teaching the system how not to forget. The moment that stunned me came late Thursday. A file appeared in the compliance queue titled Continuity, Reflections on Q3, Q4 Incentive Behavior. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a whistleblower packet. It was a white paper. Structured, calm, fully referenced, with footnotes tied to logs, not people. No emotion, no names, just logic. Haley's kind of logic. It wasn't a weapon, it was architecture. A map of what went wrong and how to reinforce what was left. She didn't blame anyone. She didn't defend herself. She simply showed the truth, quietly, thoroughly, and in their own format. The document was shared internally, and no one questioned it. No edits, no red lines, no legal filters, because it didn't attack, it reflected. And systems don't resist reflections, they absorb them. That's when I knew. She wasn't following me anymore. She had gone ahead. Haley had become the voice the system now listened to, not because she shouted, but because she stayed when others blinked. I had once built the structure to be precise, to be safe, and when they turned it into camouflage for greed, I thought I'd lost it forever. But I hadn't. I had just handed it unknowingly to someone who would someday rebuild it, without needing to be told how. That night, I closed my monitor, first time in months. No need to track anymore. She had it. Not the files, the rhythm, the language, the quiet authority of someone who never asked for power but earned it by staying through the fog. The system was no longer mine, and thank God for that. There's a moment you realize the battle isn't yours anymore, and that's not defeat, it's release. I used to think fixing the system meant staying inside it, adjusting it from within, cleaning the rot with gloves on, but sometimes the most honest thing you can do is step back and let someone else see it without your fingerprints muddying the glass. Haley never asked to be the one to carry it forward. She never raised her hand, never claimed a side, but when the silence started stretching, when the logic looped back into shadows, she was the one who stayed and mapped every echo. Not because I'd told her, not because she owed me, but because she believed the system should make sense and didn't flinch when it didn't. Watching her rebuild something I once created, then abandoned, didn't make me bitter. It made me grateful. She didn't resurrect my legacy, she rewrote it. Cleaner, quieter, sharper. And maybe that's what all this was for, not to prove I was right, but to prove someone like her could exist long enough to make it matter. They tried to erase her with routine, with empty policy, with coffee and fake kindness. But she kept showing up, writing in margins, naming ghosts. And now, the very structure that once silenced me, it listens when she speaks. That's not revenge. That's redemption. And if you're reading this, if you've ever felt erased, replaced, or told you were too small to change the thing breaking around you, remember this. You don't have to shout to be remembered. You just have to outlast the noise, because the system forgets noise, but it always remembers rhythm. And Haley, she became the rhythm. If that hits you somewhere deep, if you felt that shift, drop a 1 in the comment. Let it echo. Let them see it's not just her. And if you want to know what happens next, how one final audit flips everything they thought they buried, stick around. You haven't seen the last loop. Not yet.